Amanda Christovich has joined this show a handful of times, and glad we got to know what she does. Appreciate her insight. Sports business reporter, college sports, front office sports. She joins us on 365 Sports. Craig Smoke, I'm David Smoke. Amanda, thanks for your time. So the settlement being filed, we've heard a lot the last several weeks about what it might mean. In your opinion, what are the 2 or 3 biggest bullet points about what this means going forward?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me. I think the big headline, as we all know, right, is that today the formal documents with the sort of nuts and bolts of the settlement proposal are going to be submitted to the court. And of course, the glitziest, part of that is that athletes would theoretically be able to share revenue with their university for the first time as part of this agreement. Obviously, that's thing number one. I think the second most important thing about the settlement is that there is going to be a $2.8 billion back damages price tag for athletes going back several years who weren't able to participate in NIL before that it changed in 2021. And that's not just significant because of the number. It's significant because there are a lot of non-power conference schools that are going to be affected by this, even though the lawsuit doesn't name them as defendants, because part of the way that those damages are going to be paid is that everyone in Division I is going to have reduced revenue distributions from the NCAA. So there are a lot of schools that are not happy at all about the settlement. And then I think thing number 3 is what the settlement does not address, which is the employment question. And there's been a lot of conversation about how this settlement could, make everybody happy and provide a happy medium. The players aren't employees, but everyone's going to get, not everybody, but the players who generate the most money are going to get paid for the first time, et cetera, et cetera. But, ultimately the employment question is the biggest one looming over college sports, and this settlement isn't going to touch it at all.
So, Amanda, what will bring about the continuation of the employment conversation? I guess this provides a safe haven of sorts for a few years. Would that be fair to say? Or is this what does this ultimately do outside of just allowing the schools to be more involved when it comes to the what does it do in terms of the legal repercussions?
Yeah, what's funny is I think this settlement, here are 2 different ways that it could play out in terms of the employment question, right? The NCAA is planning to take the settlement if and when it is finalized, which, by the way, today is just one step in sort of a prolonged process where there's going to be, opportunities for objections and the judge has to approve it, et cetera, et cetera. So if and when it is finalized, the NCAA wants to take the settlement to Congress and say, hey, Congress, look at how much we've changed. Look at how many concessions we've made for the athletes. Why don't you take this settlement and make it into a law? And, oh, by the way, slip in there somewhere that we won't have to make any other changes, that the athletes are not employees. And, look, we've agreed to pay the ones who generate the most money some amount of the broadcast television revenue, but why don't we just stop there? That's what the NCAA is hoping is going to happen. Conversely, on the other hand, however, what I think might happen is that this settlement is going to be used as evidence in multiple cases, one at sort of the federal court level and 2 at the National Labor Relations Board. I think they're going to use the settlement as evidence to say, hey, this is the NCAA saying in court that they're agreeing for schools to pay players. And athletes, participating with the expectation of compensation, that's employment. So, I think that in a weird way, it can almost backfire and make these employment arguments even stronger in the cases that are going to be continuing regardless of the House settlement.
That would be so NCAA. that would just be the perfect NCAA way to go about with all this.
Amanda, Craig, you're exactly right. The players now who get NIL, and there's a bunch of them. How many of let's say the 100% play, how many of them do you think are filing taxes?
Ooh, that's a good question. Not 100%, that's for sure.
And if they become employees, won't they then start having money taken out of their whatever check that might be?
Well, that's an interesting question because the NIL money would not really have anything to do with the employment with the salaries, right? Because it would be considered like your third-party sponsorship dollars. The question is, how are these salaries going to be classified? Because the NCAA says, well, if the athletes become employees, then they're going to have to pay taxes on their scholarship money. Actually, several years ago, the IRS wrote a memo on this and said that unless the NCAA schools change the classification of a scholarship, a scholarship's still a scholarship, right? Like you have athletes or non-athlete students who do work study, for example, right? They're not taxed on their scholarship. They're just taxed on the money they make on the side. So if the NCAA and the schools decide to convert scholarships into salaries, then the players are going to be taxed on them. If they choose not to do that and start paying extra money on top of the scholarship, that's a way to, save the players a lot of money. As usual, the NCAA is threatening, a doomsday scenario that it has the opportunity to prevent. It's up to the schools and the NCAA whether they want to reclassify scholarships if players have to be employees. And that would be bad for the players. It would be anti-player. They're acting as if they wouldn't have a choice. The IRS says they would have a choice.
Amanda Christovich, Front Office Sports with us on 365 Sports.
Amanda, any idea of, the Title IX ramifications here?
Yeah, that's the other big question, right? And that's the reason why the settlement is not going to dictate which athletes should be paid what amount of money of this annual revenue share of these, roughly $22 million a year that each school can pay their players. Honestly, all of the Title IX lawyers have conflicting opinions about whether or not Title IX means the athletes all need to be paid, the men and the women need to be paid the same amount or not, whether or not there's just sort of like an opportunity of payment that needs to be the same. The Department of Education has not weighed in on this yet, and that's what everyone's really waiting for. So it's either going to be that or like another lawsuit where, let's say there's a school that says, you know what, we're going to pay our football players 75% of the revenue, even though they're only 50% of the athletes. There could be women's sports athletes who go to court over that, and there's a decision there. Like, honestly, nobody really knows. And again, it's because the Department of Education, granted, they have a lot going on, but they've not weighed in on this. And it would be helpful for all of us if they would.
Yeah, no question. And so yet, even though it's been filed, it's not official because there's still a lot of back and forth to go. But how would you describe the day that it's actually even been filed as far as when it comes to Congress and or when it comes to college athletics?
Yeah, look, so technically we're still waiting for all of these documents to come in. They're supposed to come in like 25 minutes-ish because, of course, God forbid you file documents first thing in the morning so everybody can enjoy their weekend, right?
Right. Yeah.
We're waiting for the documents to come in. I think that Congress obviously is busy with other things right now. I think that they are going to take a look at this settlement. I'm sure there will be like statements, from the sort of usual political players who speak out about whether or not they think this settlement is a good deal. But ultimately, I actually don't expect, like, even if the agreement is finalized in the next few months, I don't expect Congress to really weigh in until January.
And so another 6 months of speculation and much more.
Yes.
So this is basically a hurdle they're jumping over but it's not the finish line by any stretch, is what you're saying.
No, but what's so exciting for us college sports business nerds is that because these documents, it's obviously a major step in the process, but like for us, the documents are public once they're filed with the court. So we're going to be able to see all these nitty gritty details of, there are other things that, are maybe not making the big headlines, but, new roster limits because there are no scholarship limits anymore. There's supposed to be some sort of enforcement mechanism. Who knows what else might be in there. We're all going to get to read it. Whereas for the last couple months, at least on the record, administrators and lawyers have been relatively tight-lipped about what's in this settlement specifically outside of like the major highlights that we already talked about. So like we'll really get to see what a lot of this is going to look like for the first time.
I got a question for you on Houston Baptist. They filed, as you know, they filed a lawsuit saying that they should not be included in all of this, and they were turned down. The judge said that they decided to join the NCAA. They have to eat whatever they're going to have to pay. But he also made a comment that they had other options. What other options would Houston Baptist have had if they're under the umbrella? That's really the only umbrella when it comes to college athletics.
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess like legally the argument is you could join the NAIA instead of the NCAA if you don't want to pay this money. I mean, look, I think that there are arguments for and against whether the non-power conference schools should have to contribute or have their distributions lowered as a result of this lawsuit, because they're all making money off of the backs of players who aren't getting paid. It just depends on how much money that is, right? Especially in Division I, when they all get distributions from the men's basketball television contract. So I think, I mean, it's a good point. What other choice do they have? They clearly were, I was told by sources, and this is not news, but none of the non-power conferences or schools, for that matter, in Division I were consulted on the settlement. They weren't even told what was going to be in the settlement until it got leaked to the media. I mean, you had like Big East schools learned about what the terms of the settlement were going to be, or the broad strokes, the same time we did, which is pretty remarkable considering there was a meeting where Charlie Baker was supposed to explain to the D1 membership what it entailed, but he kept it all very close to the vest. So I understand the frustration, but at the same time, and again, this wasn't really the judge's argument, just speaking and looking at the way that the money is distributed, like all these Division I programs are benefiting from a system where the players aren't getting paid. So, they're all going to have to chip in. And ironically enough, some of them might be paying more money than they would have if they had just agreed to do employment in the first place.
So a major part of the money that the NCAA gets from like the college football playoff, the NCAA men's tournament, it does go to a lot of the conferences, especially men's basketball. But most of that money is going to the Power 5 or Autonomy 4 conferences, with Notre Dame included as well. And yet, when it comes to paying this back, everybody's going to pay basically what appears to be the same percentage?
Not the same percentage, but and again, that's something that I'm going to see, because I could tell you like the 60-40 split of the $2.8 million between the power conferences and then the rest of the conferences, but that will be hopefully in the documents of like how many millions of dollars each conference is going to expect to lose, or to just not receive that they would normally receive. It's definitely not the same. Like the power conferences are paying much more than everybody else, conference by conference. But I believe in aggregate, and again, maybe it's not even worth me saying because this will come out in the document. But if I remember correctly, like in aggregate, like all the other conferences are going to be paying, pretty close to what the power conferences are. And again, that's because, it's like the NCAA, what is the NCAA's money? It's money that ends up going to the schools anyway, right? So when the NCAA has to pay any settlement, it's money that comes out of the membership's pocket.
All right, one more thing on scholarships being increased from 11.7, example, in baseball to up to 34, 85 in football, up to 105. And then, of course, the possibility of revenue sharing that could be, I think that high figure was around $22 million. Is that the cap that schools can go to? But does that mean you could stop at $5 million with revenue sharing, or you can still just do 18 scholarships rather than 34?
I believe that I know for a fact that when it comes to the revenue sharing, you don't have to revenue share anything. This is just up to $22 million is what you would be allowed to revenue share.
Okay.
If you can't afford it, if you don't want to, that's fine. Obviously, if you're a power conference school, you're not going to be able to recruit if you're not paying the players and everybody else is, right? So that's where the incentive is.
Right.
But yeah, you can pay $5 million, $10 million. You could pay $21.9 million. And the $22 million, by the way, it's a percentage of annual athletic department revenue. So that number is going to fluctuate between like 20 and 25 every year. But the 22 is the number that everyone's kind of using just in general. So just keep that in mind that will fluctuate a little bit. As for the scholarship limits, yes, again, I believe it's the same where you don't have to offer a scholarship to every single player on your roster. But I did want to point out, because we're literally in the middle of the Olympic ceremony, that it was brought to my attention by an Olympic sports coach that for a lot of Olympic sports, the roster increase and the scholarship limits being listed is going to be really good for them, because they're going to be able to grow their sports by offering athletes the economic opportunity to have a scholarship in a sport where they may not have been able to before, like beach volleyball, for example, that you still, So I don't know. I just thought that was really interesting and like a positive spin on the roster situation that I haven't really heard much of before.
Especially in light of all I've heard is the Olympic sports are going to die off in this new era.
That's right.
I feel like that's
well,
all.
And stay tuned. I have a story on a potential solution to that problem. And also, of course, fact-checking a little bit of that rhetoric coming out tomorrow morning, shameless plug. But yes, when I wasn't working on the settlement pre-write, that's what I was doing today, was a little bit of Olympic sports pipeline writing. So that was fun. All
right, good stuff. Glad you brought that up, Craig. Amanda, thank you so much for your expertise, knowledge, insight. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
Awesome. You too. Thanks so much.
Amanda Christovich. You can go on Twitter it's A. Christovich, and then H at the end of it,